Thanks so much for joining us for today's webinar. We hope that the information presented is useful for you. Please consider sharing this resource with other caregivers. Also, please consider making a donation at the end of the presentation so that we can continue to provide these webinars free of charge.
Welcome, everybody. I'm glad you could be here today. I am Dr. Elizabeth Edgerly. I'm the Chief Program Officer for the Alzheimer's Association of Northern California and Northern Nevada. And I have the pleasure of working with our Medical Scientific Advisory Council full of brilliant researchers from Northern California. And so I'll share a bit about where we are in Alzheimer's research today. So what we're going to be covering is, and you can see in your handouts and on the slide here, we'll start with talking a bit about the history of Alzheimer's and the causes. And those go hand in hand because what we think is causing Alzheimer's today is what we thought was causing Alzheimer's over 100 years ago. I'll talk a little bit about symptoms and signs, although some of you may already know this part, so we'll do that pretty briefly. We'll also talk a little bit about the steps to getting a diagnosis, what the current treatments are, but the majority of this talk is on what does research tell us about our risk of developing Alzheimer's, how we may raise or lower that risk, and also what some of the treatments could be, or maybe even prevention for the future, so that someday we might be able to avoid developing Alzheimer's symptoms altogether, which would be a wonderful thing. So we'll get started with a little bit on the history. And I always think this is fascinating because it was over 100 years ago that Dr. Alois Alzheimer's identified the first individual who was case 0, I guess it is, case 1, with Alzheimer's. And she was a younger woman. She was actually 51 years old. Her name was Auguste Dieter was her name. And what was unique about her was that she was having these symptoms of confusion, memory loss. She was suspicious that her husband was having an affair with the hospital staff. So she was having lots of strange behaviors, and then also memory issues and language and judgment and all of that. And they had never seen that in a young person, in someone who was in their early 50s. They had seen it in elderly people and thought, well, you know, it's what happens when you're in your 80s, which didn't happen very often in 1906. But Dr. Alzheimer, after he examined Auguste, he documented it very carefully, and at autopsy he noted that she had these unique changes in her brain, these things we call plaques and tangles. And so it was documented, and it was coined Alzheimer's disease, and for probably 8 decades, most physicians were taught this is an extremely rare disease, and you may never meet anybody with Alzheimer's disease, which is a little strange to think about, isn't it? Because we're all here today probably because we know maybe many people with Alzheimer's disease. So what happened? Well, what it was is that the original individual who had Alzheimer's was deemed to have a disease because she was 51 and she had these symptoms. They thought for many years it was normal aging to develop something like Alzheimer's. And that changed in the late 70s. So it was in the 80s when we started realizing, wait a minute, these older people are experiencing the same symptoms that that younger patient did. It's the same disease. It's not normal to develop Alzheimer's disease at any age. It is a disease and not normal aging. So some of the things that he found are still there today, and I'm going to walk you through that in a little bit. But before I do, I like to define some terms so that everybody's clear when I say dementia, what I'm talking about, and these various diseases. So dementia is a term that's very confusing because it's often used incorrectly and sometimes used interchangeably with Alzheimer's. And I know I do that sometimes. But let me define what I mean by that. Dementia is really a generic term that describes symptoms that people are having. So if I have dementia, what it means is I'm having difficulty with memory functioning and language and judgment and reasoning, and maybe even having a hard time taking care of myself, and it will get worse over time. What it doesn't say is what's causing those symptoms. So what we want to know is not just, does someone have dementia? We want to know what is the cause of those symptoms of dementia. So the number one cause, as you can see on the slide, 60% of cases of dementia are caused by Alzheimer's disease. 30% are related disorders, and the remaining 10% are reversible disorders. So let me show you this one other way. So we have this umbrella term of dementia, and underneath it are the different types of dementia, the different causes of dementia. They're not all the same, and they're not all treated the same. The research I'm going to present to you today is specific to Alzheimer's disease. There are other types of research taking place with these other diseases, but that's for another day. So what are the symptoms of Alzheimer's? Again, just to make sure we're all clear on the progression a bit here. Alzheimer's tends to start with short-term memory loss. So when I say that, I mean things like, what did you have for breakfast today? Or if it's in the afternoon, what did you eat for lunch? Did you eat, and do you remember what you ate? For most of us, that's pretty easy to answer. But for a person with Alzheimer's disease, that may be really scary because they're going to draw a blank. So it may start with that short-term memory loss, but then gradually it can start to affect longer-term memories, like names of friends and family, maybe even recognizing people who you know pretty well, but gosh, it just doesn't come back. That starts to be affected. Other areas that are affected, communication, word finding can be difficult, and expressing and understanding oneself. And then, as I mentioned before, judgment and reasoning. Things like handling finances. There was an interesting research study done of people with early stage Alzheimer's, mild cognitive impairment, and no Alzheimer's or mild cognitive impairment. And they found that almost universally, the people with mild cognitive impairment and Alzheimer's had great difficulty managing their finances and also were very likely to fall victim to scams. So you hear about those scams that happen where, hey, you've won the sweepstakes. All you have to do is send us $5,000 to collect. You may have heard that one. Well, when they posed that situation to people in the study, every single person with Alzheimer's and every single person with mild cognitive impairment fell for the scam in the study when they were presented that scenario. So this is just one more reason we want to really be careful with this kind of thing when someone we care about has Alzheimer's or even mild cognitive impairment. There's also changes in behavior and mood, getting lost, perhaps for someone could be a sign, or changes in mood like anger or frustration, or withdrawal. Withdrawal is a common one. And when I think about myself, I probably would be the kind of person who would withdraw a bit. If I'm unsure if I've said something to you already, I probably won't say it again because I don't want to look foolish. And that's what happens for many people with Alzheimer's, is they start to kind of take a little step back. The last piece on this slide is that living independently and things like driving become a challenge and really something we want to take a hard look at. So what is going wrong in the brain of a person with Alzheimer's? On this slide, you can see a comparison. Half of this brain is of an individual who's healthy, a normal, healthy older adult, and the other half is a representation of a person with advanced Alzheimer's disease. And the main thing that you can see here as a difference, that we all can see without any medical training, is that the Alzheimer's brain looks smaller than the other side. What we're seeing here is atrophy or shrinkage of the brain. And the reason that is happening is that the cells are dying. And as those cells die, the brain tissue actually starts to shrink. The other thing you can see on this slide is the ventricles that are getting larger. So they're pretty subtle on the side of the healthy brain. But what this is in the center of our brain, we have cerebrospinal fluid. And in the brain of the person with Alzheimer's, that ventricle starts to get larger. It starts to look larger because the brain tissue is shrinking. So it sort of stands out a bit more. The other part here on this slide is the hippocampus, and it's circled in white. This is a really important part of our brain, and we'll talk more about it in a little bit. But what it is, it's the part of our brain where new learning takes place. So remembering what you had for breakfast requires your hippocampus to take note. You had breakfast and this is what you had. It's not going to keep it forever, but it will store it, right? Store it in another part of your brain temporarily. That tends to be the first place affected in Alzheimer's. And that's why short-term memory is affected before long-term memory. because that hippocampus tends to be struck really early. So what do we think is causing? Well, again, it goes back to Alois Alzheimer. He identified plaques and tangles, and that's still what we're talking about today. So you can see on the slide an image of plaque. The plaque in that slide is outside of the cell, and it's that brown cloud of debris that you see there. And then you can also see the tau tangles, and I'm going to walk you through how these form. Here's an example of a healthy neuron forest where there's lots of connections, there's signaling taking place, you want a lot of density, a lot of connections between brain cells. In the brain of someone who's developing Alzheimer's disease, that starts to break down. So what we'll see here is that there's these plaques, which again looks like a little field of debris out there. And then there are these tangles that are essentially dead brain cells. So let me tell you what we think is happening here. So first, let's talk about plaque. In this, what looks like a very complex slide, I'm going to show you how we think that plaque is forming. And bear with me, I promise it will make sense by the time I'm done with this, even though it looks scary to begin with. So in this, you see this long bluish purple protein here. That is called the amyloid precursor protein, or APP. And I picture this, and you can actually see it in this image as well, almost like I picture hair on our head. So we've got a little bit inside our scalp, in the hair follicle, and then we have a longer bit outside of our scalp. And that's how the APP protein is. A little bit inside the brain, the cell, the neuron, but the majority of it is outside of the cell. So along comes this enzyme, and on your slide, it's called beta secretase. Beta secretase is an enzyme, and you can picture this as the shears coming along, right? The shears come by and they cut that hair, that protein, in one particular place. Then along comes another enzyme called gamma secretase, and it cuts it again. So you've got the first cut by beta secretase. You have the second cut by gamma secretase. And what happens is those two cuts release this little piece of protein called beta amyloid. It's called different things, amyloid beta, beta amyloid, A beta. That's all the same thing. It's just I don't know why, but we talk about it in different ways. We'll call it beta amyloid today. So it releases this little fragment of this protein. And what I want you to think about is when it does that, it's almost as if it's turning it into a piece of duct tape. It becomes sticky, and it's floating around in the brain. So imagine that. You have this little piece of sticky protein floating around. That can't be good, right? What we want is for our brain to clear it out. And that's what we think happens in people who don't develop Alzheimer's. That their bodies go, hey, wait a minute, let's get rid of that stuff. Let's clear it out, and just gets rid of it. For some reason, in the brain of people who develop Alzheimer's disease, these stick around, and they literally stick to each other. And then what they think is that the brain is perhaps being adaptive in gathering it all into one place. Just like we handle garbage in society, we don't just let it lay all over the place. We gather it up. We put it in the garbage can. We take the garbage can out to the bigger garbage can. We take that off to the landfill or the recycling company. So we're handling it. But what happens in the brain of a person with Alzheimer's is there's only so much room. There's only so much space for landfill. So you put a plaque over here, a plaque over here, a plaque over here. It's not good to live near the dump. Things start to go badly, and that's the same in the brain. Anything that's near the plaque is damaged and ultimately dies. And that's what's happening. So that is the beta amyloid. That is the plaque story that you're hearing. And that's one part of the story. Now is the other part of the story, tau. And this one is perhaps a little more difficult to explain, but I think I can do it. So in your brain cell, you have a structure that's called microtubules. And I'm going to use lots of analogies, so you have to bear with me on this. I think of this as almost like a railroad track inside our brain cells. And we've got nutrients, food, supplies, all of that being transported in these microtubules like a railroad track. Well, the tau in this system is like the nails in the railroad track. So you know you've got the rails, you've got the ties, and you've got the nails holding everything together. Well, the tau protein holds everything in place. And for some reason, phosphorus comes along and sticks to that tau protein, which is holding everything together. The phosphorus comes along and it pops out of position. Literally, pops out. Scientists can show you pictures of this. Before phosphorus, after phosphorus. It just pops out. When it pops out, it's like the nails have come off the railroad track and all hell breaks loose. The whole thing starts to unravel. And when you think back to what that tau looked like inside that brain cell, that tangle, it looked like a tangled mess. And that's what it is. The microtubules completely unravel and kill the brain cell that they were inside of. So this slide may look a little daunting at first, but let me walk you through this. So on the bottom axis of this diagram is clinical disease stage. So what I mean by this, and I'm going to use myself as an example. I'm 48 years old, and I believe I'm cognitively normal at this point. So let's say I am in the cognitively normal area of this graph, but over time I am going to develop mild cognitive impairment and dementia. On the other axis, you can see what's called the biomarker magnitude. And what that means is how much of these proteins that I've been talking to you, how much are they changing? What is going on with them? So we start off cognitively normal. So again, I'm going to use myself. At 48, what could be happening in my brain many, many years before I develop any symptoms of Alzheimer's is, remember the beta amyloid, the little fragments that get cut up and they become sticky? Those may be starting to get cut and floating in my brain. And so this first line in red that says A beta, that stands for beta amyloid. And that means that researchers could theoretically measure those levels in my brain before I have any symptoms. What they think is happening is that if I start to have that, then after a number of years, it could be 5 years from now, the tau changes start to take place. And they think that those two things are related. That the beta amyloid floating around perhaps then starts to affect the tau. And once the tau pops out of position, as I showed you before, then it triggers all the other sequence of events. So once tau pops out, then you start, after a couple of years, seeing changes in brain structure that could even be seen on a brain scan. And after that happens, then I might start showing memory impairment that's significant enough to show up on tests. Even a couple of more years later, that's when I may start having judgment issues or reasoning or language trouble. So what you're seeing in this diagram is that we are saying long before someone develops Alzheimer's, these changes have been taking place for maybe decades. And damage has been taking place along the way. They call it the cascade hypothesis because the view is the first change in beta amyloid starts to trigger the tau changes that triggers the brain structure changes, etc. And so the idea is, well, if we could identify the people in the beginning who are having changes in beta amyloid, could we prevent this from progressing? Or could we intervene in such a way to offset that? And that is what the field is most excited about, is this notion of intervening as early as possible to try to prevent damage from taking place. So when we talk about diagnosis today, there is no single test that you can go out and get to find out if you have Alzheimer's. We're all hoping that that changes, and there's some exciting research that suggests perhaps it will. You may have read some headlines about a blood test or a brain scan, and they're getting there, but they're not ready for prime time. They're research studies for the most part. So what the diagnostic process requires for all of us at this point is an evaluation, including medical history, mental status testing, neurological and physical exam, and various kinds of tests. Blood tests to see if something else might be wrong to account for issues, and brain imaging to see if there have been strokes or tumors, and to look for that shrinkage that I showed you a minute ago. If someone has Alzheimer's, these are the medications that are currently FDA approved. And there are two different kinds. Aricept, Exelon, and Razodine are in one class. Those are called acetylcholinesterase inhibitors. It's a mouthful. Cholinesterase inhibitors is what those are called. And then there's memantine or Namenda, which is another class of drugs. And that works on a different system in the brain. Many times people take both Aricept or Exelon or Razodine with Namenda, especially in the middle and later stages of the disease. But in addition to the medications, which I want to say a little bit about these medications, they're not miracle drugs. They help some people, but it can be very subtle to tell whether or not they're helping. And what's tricky about this is an effective treatment for Alzheimer's could be one that just slows the progression slightly over where you would be without a medication. So telling that that's effective is going to be very difficult. If I'm taking the medication and it's helping me, but I'm still getting worse, my husband is probably going to think that the medications aren't helping. And the only way we'll know for sure is to take me off the medication and see, ooh, gosh, now she's not doing very well. And that's not ideal, to lose ground. So these medications are what we would call symptomatic relief. They don't, unfortunately, alter the beta amyloid or the tau at all. So underneath these medications, the disease keeps going. But there's other things beyond pills, and it's really important for families and individuals with a diagnosis to look at these as well. So mental activities, staying as active as possible in ways you enjoy staying active. So I don't mean playing chess to torture yourself, but really to do things that you like to do to keep stimulated. And perhaps more than anything, exercise. If you're able to physically exercise, it's good for all of us, regardless of whether we have Alzheimer's. And some research has suggested that it's especially helpful for people with Alzheimer's, and maybe even as good as some of these medications. Another piece is psychosocial support, education, planning. These have been shown to be effective treatments for families and individuals going through Alzheimer's and other types of dementia as well. So now I'm going to show you a video. This is from the Facts and Figures that the Alzheimer's Association produces every year. This is the 2014 video. And I want to just take a moment to share with you some statistics in this video to give you a sense of how many people are affected. And in this year's report, the focus was in particular on women and how women are disproportionately affected by Alzheimer's. So here we go. So sobering statistics, and certainly for the women in the room. Yeah, so what we really want to do is see how we can alter that trajectory. We know that the numbers are growing in terms of people affected. So let's talk now a bit about risk factors for Alzheimer's. We know that women are disproportionately affected. But the reason that we're disproportionately affected is primarily because of age, because we live longer than men. And we know that as we age, for every decade, every 5 years over the age of 65, our risk doubles of developing Alzheimer's disease. So the older we are, the higher the risk. They used to think that if you hit 90 and you didn't have Alzheimer's, you didn't have to worry about Alzheimer's anymore. But that's unfortunately not true. You would be at your greatest risk if you're 90 than you ever were before. So other risk factors, though, that you can see on the slide: genetics, and we'll talk about that in a little more depth in just a minute, head injury, gender, as we covered, stroke, people who've had strokes are at greater risk, diabetes, and then lifestyle. So we'll walk through some of these. So as I mentioned, age is a major factor, and this slide shows to you what's going on with the population in the United States and actually Western Europe, where the baby boomer population is making it so that there are more older adults, and in particular, old adults than ever before. And that's why we're seeing these numbers grow so quickly in terms of Alzheimer's. The other risk factor that I mentioned a moment ago was genetics. So if you have a parent with Alzheimer's disease, undoubtedly you're wondering, am I going to get Alzheimer's disease? Well, I think of it in much the way I think of heart disease. So my father and his parents all had heart disease, so I know I have a greater risk of developing heart disease. Alzheimer's is very similar in that regard. Does it raise my risk if my dad had Alzheimer's? Yes. Does it mean I will necessarily get Alzheimer's? No. It just raises my risk. But the genetics do play a role. So let's start with the genes on this slide called the presenilin 1 and 2 and the APP genes. Now these are very rare genes. They're autosomal dominant genes that are deterministic. And what do I mean by all that? Well, what I mean is that these are the kinds of genes where if I inherit one of these mutations, I will get Alzheimer's if I live long enough. They are also, as I said, very rare. So they come from families where half of the members of that family have had Alzheimer's, and they tend to get it at a very young age, in their 30s and 40s and 50s. So for most of us, when we talk about Alzheimer's, we're talking about people who are elderly, over 75, over 85. But in this case, these genes tend to affect people at a younger age. The gene that most of us are more likely to have as a potential risk factor for Alzheimer's is called the ApoE4 gene. And this is entirely different. This is not a deterministic gene where if you inherit it, you will develop Alzheimer's. Instead, this is a risk factor gene, meaning if you inherit it, you have a higher risk. You won't necessarily get Alzheimer's, but you would have a higher risk. So the E4 gene, the ApoE gene, comes in 3 forms: the E2, E3, and E4 version. And it's just the E4 version, of which about 20% of the population has at least one copy of the E4 version. It's that version that raises the risk. It means that instead of getting Alzheimer's at age 75, you might get it at age 70 or age 68. But again, it's not necessarily that you're going to get it at all. So sometimes people debate, should I go get tested for this gene? The question is, what will you do if you find out you have this gene? We can't stop it from progressing. If you think, well, I'd exercise more and I'd eat better and I'd do all these things, well, maybe you should just do those things now without going out and getting the test. So in general, the Alzheimer's Association does not recommend that people go get tested for these genes until such point as we have something that you can really do to alter that trajectory, that future. The other category up top here is late onset genes. And these have been emerging over the last few years. There may be as many as 10 to 15 genes that have been identified. But they're really small players here. They may raise someone's risk by 1%. And so for the most part, for for us talking about genetics, those are not going to be a major factor for us. And the last thing I want to say is most people who develop Alzheimer's do not have a known gene for Alzheimer's. Now, maybe it's that we haven't discovered the gene yet, or maybe it's that there's more to the story than the genetics. And I think that's very likely, that there's more going on than just the genetics. So early identification is a key area of research, and I think this is probably the area where we've made the most advances in the last 5 years. I talked about genetic testing, but I was talking about, for those of us in the room, should you go get tested, shouldn't you? For researchers, it's a different ballgame. In a research experiment, they want to test the subjects in their studies to see, do you carry this gene? How does this treatment work on you if you have this gene? What does your brain look like if you have this gene? So it's different. In many research studies, they do genetic testing, and they have found in some cases people who have the E4 gene may respond differently to some medications than people who don't have the E4 gene. So they do that quite often, and it is one piece to help identify people at greater risk. The other piece that you may have heard a bit in the news about is brain scans. And they've been doing PET scans and MRIs for years. But in more recent years, they've developed PET scans that can actually light up beta amyloid. Remember the beta amyloid and the plaques. And so they used to have to wait till death to see if someone had plaques and tangles in their brain. And they do that, but they now can also do a scan and say, wow, this person has a lot of beta amyloid, a lot of plaque in their brain. And they're able to then help to identify people at risk and help confirm diagnoses. Now, this is actually a complicated story because it's not as clean as you would think. And some of you may have seen the 60 Minutes story the other night where they were talking about some of this, that many healthy older adults with no signs of Alzheimer's have positive amyloid scans, meaning they go in, they're doing great, they take the scan and they go, wow, this person has a brain full of plaques, but no symptoms. So if you're going to get Alzheimer's, that's the kind of Alzheimer's you want to get, right? The symptom-free kind. Well, so they're looking and they're trying to understand, how does that happen? How can some people have plaques but no symptoms, and other people have plaques and Alzheimer's symptoms? It may be that tau may be really important, that the beta amyloid alone might not be enough, but when you start having problems with tau, that could trigger symptoms. So now what's most exciting in the research is they are developing tau scans. So they not only will be able to see plaques, but they can see tau and the tangles. And when that happens, the researchers, you can see, they start to salivate over this stuff. And you can see they get very excited because tau and tangles is related to symptoms. If somebody has tangles, they very likely have Alzheimer's or another type of dementia. And so this could be very helpful for identifying people and intervening really early. The next one is cerebrospinal fluid A-beta. What do I mean by that? And you might have heard about this as well, that they can do spinal taps to see if that free-floating beta amyloid is in the system. I don't know if you're going to run out to your doctor and say, please give me a spinal tap. But this is very exciting for researchers because they can see those early changes, enroll people in studies, and try to intervene to prevent it from progressing. And then the last one is biomarkers, and that includes a whole host of things, including things like blood tests, maybe a urine test, that kind of thing. And they're working on that and making some progress. So what can you do to reduce your risk? Well, there's no guarantees. I know many brilliant individuals who exercised regularly, ate right, all that, and developed Alzheimer's. But perhaps they developed it later than they would have if they hadn't done all of those things. We don't know. What we do know is what seems to be correlated is heart health, exercise, cardiovascular disease. So obviously, the better your heart health, the more you exercise, that's a positive risk factor, a way to reduce your risk. Cardiovascular disease, obesity, and diabetes are related to increased risk of developing Alzheimer's. And then they've found, for example, that taking beta blockers or antihypertension drugs, high blood pressure medications, can lower your risk. So with this kind of research, you have to be careful because sometimes you'll read one study finds one thing, and then you'll read that another study finds the exact opposite, and it can be pretty frustrating. So what I look for is a large amount of studies that are coming together. And the areas where they agree in this area of the research is exercise. Exercise is a good way to potentially reduce your risk of developing Alzheimer's. Brain games, stimulation, novel activities, it's unclear. But certainly there's correlational studies that show that people who are more engaged in bridge and other kinds of stimulating activities appear to have a lower risk of getting Alzheimer's. The trick with that is it may be that people who are developing Alzheimer's years before stop playing bridge, that it starts to affect their abilities. So it isn't necessarily that bridge keeps you from getting Alzheimer's, but perhaps you kind of pull back on bridge if you're developing it. We don't know, and that's why you want to take it with a grain of salt. Nutrition seems to play a role. I think the strongest evidence is actually for what's called the Mediterranean diet. And this is a diet rich in fish and fruits and vegetables and wine and olive oil and not so much refined sugar and red meat and a lot of the things that many of us eat, French fries and things like that. So really boosting the vegetables and fruits. And then last but not least, social and emotional well-being appears to play a role. So people who are social butterflies and who are not depressed appear to have a lower risk than people who are depressed and stay to themselves. Again, this could be a chicken and an egg kind of thing, where it may be that people are pulling back because they're starting to have difficulties. So I wanted to show you this next slide because it goes a little deeper into the notion that exercise is good for your brain. And this made a pretty big splash a couple of years ago when it came out. So let me walk you through what the study was. In this study, they had two groups. They had one group that every day did stretching and toning exercises. And in the other group, they walked briskly for 10 to 40 minutes a day. After a year, they did brain scans, they did middle of the study brain scans, and then they did 1 year brain scans. And they were looking at the hippocampus. Remember, the hippocampus is that part of your brain that helps with new learning? And they found that the people in the walking group grew their hippocampus by 1% during the course of the study. And the people in the stretching group, actually, it declined, as you would normally expect it to. I didn't say that before, but as we age, our hippocampus shrinks 1%, a little teeny bit each year. Maybe why it's a little harder to remember things for us sometimes, right? And so the researchers felt that it wasn't that stretching was bad for you. It was just that walking was really good. So aerobic exercise appeared to make a difference. The other piece that's interesting about this study is it wasn't just that they could see it on the brain scan. They could see it in testing. They could show that the memory in the walking group was better than the people in the stretching group. So this is one more reason to say, get out there, put on your sneakers and lace up and do some exercise. Experimental treatments. Now the tricky thing with this is these change almost monthly. So I want to speak in some general terms. There are some drugs that are being examined that look promising, and they are a mouthful. Let me pronounce these for you. So under drugs, I have bapineuzumab, solanezumab, crenezumab, and gantenerumab. They're quite the thing to pronounce. But you'll notice they all end in the letters MAB, which stands for monoclonal antibodies. So these are essentially immunotherapies. They use antibodies and they attack beta amyloid and clear it from the brain. So those are being studied. They're also looking at beta secretase inhibitors. Remember, the beta secretase was the one that came along first and cut the amyloid precursor protein. They're trying to inhibit that. Say, what if we could keep that cut from happening? Maybe then we could prevent this from occurring. And now, again, perhaps most exciting, at least to me personally, is these tau-based drugs. They now have drugs in phase 1 clinical trials. Those are those early trials, looking at, can we reduce the issues with tau where it's popping out of position? They're also looking to repurpose FDA-approved drugs things that are approved for other purposes, like insulin, nasal insulin in particular, and some cancer treatments. There was a skin cancer drug they were looking at. So these, you hear about them and then they go away, which is never good in science, when you hear about it and it goes away, because if there's a negative finding, sometimes you don't hear about that as loudly as you hear about the positive findings. So I'm not sure how these are progressing right now. They're still looking at other options like anti-inflammatory drugs. Inflammation is a factor. And what they know is that these plaques and tangles cause the brain to react and our body to react. And so one idea is if we could reduce the inflammatory response, maybe we could reduce the damage. And so there is some evidence that anti-inflammatory medications may help. Some people are interested in coconut oil and ketones, so thinking that there may be an alternative source of nutrition for the brain. There has not been much research done on this, so if you've heard about coconut oil, it's more anecdotal. I'm very eager for them to do research on this and really see, does it make a difference? It's not a particularly risky or dangerous thing to try out, but so far I anecdotally haven't seen a lot of people saying, yes, this made a big difference. But I know people disagree on that. So I'd love to see this studied more. And then last but not least, there's also some research on deep brain stimulation, where they're stimulating part of the brain as people do activities. It's kind of science fiction-esque, where they're putting these big sensors on people. But there's some evidence that maybe that helps. My guess is that's not going to be a game changer for us. We need something that's going to prevent the damage from occurring. And that's where a lot of the energy is going. That's what these studies are about, early intervention trials. The A4 trial is new, but let me talk in more general terms. Remember, I kept talking about that cascade hypothesis, and when the beta amyloid starts, I might have, 5 years before the tau starts to change. Well, they are starting to try to identify people at greatest risk of developing Alzheimer's and intervening at that first step. When the beta amyloid starts to change, what if we gave people those drugs that I just outlined for you? What if we gave them those before they had any symptoms of Alzheimer's? And that's what is happening right now. They're doing it in people with the genes who will develop Alzheimer's. That's the Colombian study. These are these young people who are in a family in Colombia who are destined to develop Alzheimer's. And they're in their 20s and 30s. It's heartbreaking. And they are such heroes because they are signing up in the prime of their youth to do this Alzheimer's research and take these experimental drugs to see, can it keep them from getting Alzheimer's? So we're looking at this carefully, because if we can do this, the issues will change for us. It will be that maybe when you're 50, you go in to get your Alzheimer's screening when you go to get your colonoscopy. You go and get a blood test or something and see if there's a change, and let's start treating you so that you don't develop Alzheimer's. That's really what we're looking for here. We, of course, want to have treatments that are helpful for people with Alzheimer's now, and they are working on that, especially those repurposed drugs. But the idea is, let's do both. Let's treat people with Alzheimer's now, but let's really try to keep people from ever getting it. And the next area of research is caregiver research. I've been talking exclusively about research related to not getting Alzheimer's or treating Alzheimer's, but I want to point out another area, and that is what is helpful to those of you who are caring for a loved one or friend or family member with Alzheimer's. And so there are research studies that are actively recruiting, and there are approaches that have been found to be more helpful than others. And some of it is that kind of surrounding the family and accessing a variety of services works much better than people just going it alone and handling it all on their own. They have been able to establish that it reduces depression and stress and well-being. Well-being improves, all of these things when families access help from others. So I encourage you to get involved in that if you haven't. And that's what this next slide is about. The Alzheimer's Association has a program called Trial Match. And Trial Match is a matching service for clinical studies, including caregiver research and healthy normal controls and people with Alzheimer's, and seeing in your area, are there any studies that you would qualify for that you might like to participate in? So I've done this. I called up the 800 number. I answered 5 questions or so, and they said, oh, you matched to a web study. Would you like to participate in a long-distance caregiver project? Because I care for my mom who lives in Maine. And I thought, sure, I'll do that. And so I participated, and I felt like it was something I could do to make a difference, in addition to the other things I do. So if you're interested, I encourage you to go on our website and sign up or call the 800 number. And lastly, I want to share with you some resources. So alz.org is the Alzheimer's Association's website. We have a whole research section and tons of information about Alzheimer's and the latest information about that. So I encourage you to visit our website. In addition, if you have a question that you cannot find the answer to at alz.org, I often will go to alzforum.org, which is a research-specific website for researchers. So it's not pretty and it's not easy to read, but sometimes I will find something, someone will ask me a question I can't answer, I go and look it up and I'll find a whole summary of research. So that's a useful website. And the last one is the federal government's website, www.alzheimers.gov, and they have wonderful information. Some of those images you saw in my slides were from alzheimers.gov. So with that, I'm going to end with this and just encourage you, if you have questions, if you hear something in the news and you're like, hey, what does this mean for us? If you're unsure of how to interpret a research finding, I encourage you to give us a call or go on our website. And of course, if you're caring for a loved one with Alzheimer's, please, please access the many services that we have. So thank you for joining us today. I hope you've gotten some questions answered and that this was helpful. Thanks.
Thank you so much for joining us today for this informative webinar. We'd love to continue providing these webinars free of charge, so please consider making a donation at the link below.